Today in the France 24 debate, how is the Russian president really doing? Last month, Vladimir Putin welcomed the world to his hometown of St. Petersburg, the Russian president basking in the glory, while the U.S. president, who talked himself into a corner over Syria, failed to win the room at the G20 summit over the idea of airstrikes against Damascus. Contrast the image of Putin the statesman with this past weekend's worst race riots in the capital in 3 years. Central Asian and Caucasus migrants targeted after the stabbing death of a European Russian, riots followed up by mass arrests of migrants, 1,200 detained. There's also the 30 Greenpeace activists held without bail on charges of piracy. This over a protest at an Arctic drilling platform. Ripple effects include, wait for it, a diplomatic falling out between Russia and the Netherlands and accusations of diplomats on both sides getting roughed up at their homes. What does it all say about today's Russia? And the man who's counting down the days until he next hosts the world, that'll be at next February's Sochi Olympics. Today in the France 24 debate, what Russians really want. With us to talk about it from London, Ben Judah, the author of Fragile Empire, How Russia Fell In and Out of Love with Vladimir Putin. Welcome to the debate. Joining us from Istanbul, Sergei Markov, former member of the Russian parliament for Putin's United Russia, now director of the Institute of Political Studies. Glad you could be with us. You can read her columns every Tuesday in the International New York Times. I'm getting used to saying International New York Times, the former Herald Tribune. Celestine Bolin, welcome back. Your next column, October the 29th. And also joining us, Olga Nikolaeva of the Paris-based advocacy group Russie Liberté. I guess you could say Russia Freedom would be sort of the translation. Exactly. Thank you for being with us. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. Let's start with the day's news out of Moscow. Prominent Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny, who recently ran for mayor of the capital, given a suspended sentence, thus avoiding 5 years in a penal colony after his embezzlement conviction. Celestine Bolin, is that the authorities playing good cop?
I mean, I think basically they must have decided that they didn't need to aggravate a situation. Navalny has been boosted by the recent mayoral elections in Moscow to be a real political player, to sort of throw more oil on the fire of selective justice against political opponents. It seems to me Kremlin just took a kind of a sidestep on this. I mean, they will argue they had nothing to do with it, but that, frankly, I don't think is very credible, because in any one of these high-profile cases, obviously, the Kremlin has its say.
Sergei Markov, is this you could say, a happy conclusion to this story?
I'm happy because I doesn't like people to go to the prison. Even Alexei Navalny, I think for economic crime, it's not so good to push people to the prison. Also, I'm satisfied that if Alexei Navalny, who now became the leading oppositional leader, will be in the prison, it's not so good for image of Russia. But at the same time, I think the court which allow Alexei Navalny to continue his political activity, nevertheless, the court couldn't ignore the fact that Alexei Navalny stolen some money. It's a very clear fact. He replaced commercial existed before Alexei Navalny started to consult them. Then it was a very well-known broadcasting, publishing of the telephone call between Alexei Navalny and another guys who discuss how they can push managers of Kirillov to sell to their commercial firms very cheap. And if manager doesn't allow to sell cheap, how to take it off with.
Okay, so I'm going to interrupt you because I'm going to interrupt you, Sergei Markov, because the phone line is not of great quality. We're going to try to call you back and and get you on a better line. But what you're saying effectively is that he was, for you, nonetheless convicted, even though you don't like to see people put in jail for economic crimes, and you're stressing this fact. Now, also this Wednesday, a migrant worker found stabbed to death in the same Moscow neighborhood that was rocked this week by race riots. It all started last Thursday, the stabbing death of a European Russian in the Buryulovo district. Crowds of Russians roaming the streets over the weekend, hunting for non-Slavic men who matched a police description of his alleged killer. A suspect arrested, filmed on state television Tuesday as he was brought back to the capital by helicopter from the city of Kolomna. In a video released by police, Orhan Zelenov admitting to the stabbing, but insisting that he acted in self-defense. Olga Nikolaeva, your thoughts on this the sequence of events that we've seen, surprising sequence of events since last week?
Well, for me, it was a very personal affair because I am going to Moscow on Friday, this Friday, and I wanted to stay at my brother's place in Buryulovo, in the street where all the things happened. And now I'm just very afraid of even being in the streets with my appearance of non-to slave, I can say so. I'm very scared personally. What's going on in Russia, from my point of view, is that we have very difficult conditions for workers, like legal or illegal, that are really ghettoist in these suburbs of Moscow. They have very hard life there, and they become rather victims of manipulation. Instead of being charged for corruption, the employers of these workers, they pay the money to the police, and then this situation as a whole thing is just maybe a clash of energy, that one part of the society who lives in the same condition as these so-called illegal immigrants, because they thought that they were legal immigrants. They thought that they have their papers, and they paid all necessary things to get their papers, but they just cannot get them in their hands. And now they become responsible for this absolutely criminal affair, and rather unique criminal affair. So what's going on is
right,
this.
But why this unleashing of violence over the weekend?
It's in Russia from recent years, let's say maybe 4 or 5 years, we have an increase of nationalistic movements. We have Russian marches on the 4th of November. We have almost the support of the state to these radical movements called Orthodox radicalists, who went in the streets and they fight with these persons that are gathered for manifestations, like in support to Pussy Riot, for example. We saw this radicalization and the support of the police to these groups. So there is a politics of support to the nationalistic groups, and we see directly that people consider the problems coming from these illegal immigrants, but this is not actually true, because illegal immigrants, they pay their money to police, and they think that they have all the papers. And if we compare, for example, my brother's family, that are, let's say, internal immigrants, because they come from another region in Russia to Moscow, and they live in the same conditions as all these so-called Caucasian people. So there is no real difference. It is a constructed difference in nationalism.
But there's this rise, as you say, of nationalism. Ben Judah, how do you explain the violence that we saw over the weekend?
Well, this is being called a race riot, and I think that's a mistake, because a race riot is when an ethnic minority riots against the police, and we've seen this in London, we've seen this in Paris. What happened in Moscow is when an ethnic majority riots against an influx of migrants. So it's more like a racist riot. Question is why? And these kind of losses of control, these outbreaks of violence have become very common in Russia ever since 2006. You have 1 or 2 annually, mostly in villages or small regional town centres. And the reason comes back to the answer to most problems in Russia, which is corruption, which is the police is so embedded with corruption that local ethnic Russians don't feel they're being protected. Construction and agricultural work is so embedded with corruption that large amounts of immigrants are being brought in without the proper documentation, without the proper housing, without the proper health insurance, which leads to a situation where you have large populations living, I think ghetto is the wrong word, you have large populations living in shacks, living 10 to a room, living often in the basements of council housing, which has been illegally rented out to them. And you have local ethnic Russians feeling that this sudden influx they're not being protected from all the kind of nefarious effects this could bring, and blaming an increase in crime on this. There's a kind of bigger macro picture of what's going on in Russia, which is Russia traditionally was not an immigrant society, but in the past 15 years, Russia's become the second most popular country for immigrants in the world, following the United States. You have more than 12 million immigrants that have come to Russia, mostly to the big cities such as Moscow or St. Petersburg or Novosibirsk, and over 2/3 of them are from Central Asia and the Caucasus. Of course, these states used to be part of the Soviet Union, but normal Russians didn't really experience them. These were far-off colonial territories, coloured in red on the map, but local Russians weren't really aware of just how different people were. So in the kind of current atmosphere, you have two forces fanning the flames. I agree with what the previous participant was just saying, that the government's encouragement of orthodox radicals to shore up its position against the opposition has been increasing tension. But also the Russian opposition has been fanning flames towards public antagonism towards illegal migrants. Alexei Navalny, who we were just talking about, has been running a very consistent campaign over the past few years for Russia to impose visas on the Caucasus and Central Asia. And he is very frequently indulging in xenophobic and anti-migrant rhetoric, and he wasn't the only person to do so in the election for the mayor of Moscow that just happened. In fact, every single candidate, from the communists to the Putin's candidate Sergei Sobyanin, all ran anti-migrant campaigns to one degree or another. So I think the Russian opposition also has to take part of the blame for being willing to undermine and criticise Putin using the race card over the past year or two.
All right, we have a tweet here from Alexandrel saying, I just don't understand how immigration is such an issue in a country the size of Russia. Celestine Bowen, can you? I think it's just, we just heard Ben Judah explain how.
Exactly. I mean, and in fact, I think it's, some people say proportionately it has the largest immigrant population. I mean, something like 7%. And when you talk about 7% out of 140 million, that's a lot of people. Some estimates up to 10 million, and that's probably only just illegal, because there are a lot of illegal. And so, I mean, I don't think we should sort of disassociate this issue in Russia from the issue that we all hear every day, all the time, in Europe. I mean, in the UK and France.
An aging population.
An aging population no longer able to fill its workforce. I mean, the Minister of Immigration, not of Migration Services, recently said that Russia needs officially 300,000 workers a year. The issue is, as always with Russia, in particular, I would say the recent period, is how does a sort of a legitimate social need get administered, executed, and taken care of? And the answer is not well, and not well at all. And in fact, to the point where it is almost criminal, the way people are living. I mean, as Ben said, it's it's not even shanty towns. We're talking people piled into, there was recently a raid on a place where people were ready to sort of all spread all over the floor. They don't have any toilets. I mean, taken care of by, under the responsibility of businessmen who've paid bribes in order to have the permits. The people themselves often have to pay out of the pocket to get the permit to get as far as Moscow. And the case of this vegetable market, I mean, as I understand it, I'm not in Moscow, but apparently in October there was a raid. There was an inspection by the health services, by the migration services, and by the police. And they came away and said, no, it's fine. So, I mean, if they said it's fine yet then, and today they just arrested 1,200 people for being illegal, that tells you that something took place back then. which was obviously somebody got paid off. And really, and that's why
All right, that's your assumption
corruption
there.
is sort of, I mean, yes, exactly. It's my assumption. But I
tried
mean,
to jump-
corruption is a very sort of, embedded part of this problem, as it is with so many other problems.
Ben Judah.
I'd just like to jump in there. What ethnic Russians living in these neighborhoods often say is that they come from a very atomized society. People come from very small families, one son, maybe two brothers, very little contact with cousins, and they're very much alone doing their trading, setting up their shops, doing their business in these places. And you suddenly have an inundation of people from the Caucasus and people from Central Asia with very, very tight clan and family structures. So a very common story you hear in these Moscow suburbs is that one Russian guy got into a fight with one Azeri guy, and this Russian guy suddenly finds himself surrounded by 20 Azeris. And even though Russians are, of course, the majority in the country by 85% of the population minimum, you're seeing a lot of insecurity in these places where atomized individuals feel they're outnumbered in their own homes and cities. And this has led to an increase in popularity of vigilante groups, which offer so-called protection if you fall into trouble or fall into disputes in markets or so on and so forth. Last year, I was invited to participate in a raid run by a vigilante group that were going through a Moscow suburb, chasing out of the basements of council estates illegal migrants. And the reason that these people were doing this is because the local council authorities, so this was kind of state social housing, had taken these basements that were supposed to be held in common by the Muscovites and filled them chock-a-block with 20, 30, 40 illegal immigrants living in absolute squalor, and had become a health hazard. So despite constantly telephoning the police and the authorities asking these people to be removed, nothing had happened, which meant locals living in these blocks have been forced to turn to the far-right vigilante group, which believed in a kind of incoherent and strange mixture of white pride, Russian opposition politics, and the idea that's most interesting to me is that Putin has betrayed Russia by bringing in tens of millions of Muslim immigrants to keep its economy going.
All right, we're going to pick up on this point when we come back. And again, I want your reaction, especially you were saying with your brother living in that neighborhood where this happened. Stay with us, much more to come. This is the France 24 debate.